All right. Does this look right? Does this look like a full screen image?
Yep.
Awesome. Cool. Oh, no, where's it going? Okay, there we go. Okay, really quickly before I begin, yeah. So I guess just thanks for the introduction, Paula. Yeah, I've been lucky enough to be doing debate for. I started when I was in high school in my sophomore junior year. So I've been doing debate now for 9, 10 years. Soon, I think it's nearly the 10-year anniversary soon. Sorry, I don't know who just called me. Ignoring that. In terms of back to the main topic though, I IR was always one of my favorite things. Partly just because to me it was always the most diverse in terms of possible topic areas, right? I think one of the things we're gonna see really soon is that international relations, even as like a frame itself, touches on just about everything in the world. So it's hard to almost view IR as like one specific thing, but we'll go into how you can and how you can try and narrow things down to at least get more of a grasp of what it is, admittedly like an enormous topic. So, I'm going to go over like I think five big areas in the conversation today. One, what are international relations? Like what is this as a whole? Two, what are some basic IR theories or lenses? There are different ways. If IR is kind of like math in the sense that generally speaking, there are like certain things that everyone agrees on, right? Like in this case, like in math's case, there are numbers. In IR, it's like obviously there are like countries and states, right? But the way that those things interact with each other depend on different kind of theories or different frameworks in which you're looking for. So I'm going to talk about some of the different versions of that. Thirdly, we're going to talk about what are some common frameworks of typical IR debates. What are the most common ways to look at them? How do they interact with each other? How can we think about IR in debate context and also non-debate context? Fourthly, we're going to talk about what are some common pitfalls to avoid. There's a lot of what are specifically the hardest things about it? What can we do about that? And lastly, what are valuable questions to think about in terms of IR rounds, but also just in general when we think about IR topics as a whole. If at any point any of you have any questions, uh, please, I think what'll be easiest is if you write it in the chat, just because I can't see all of your, oh, actually I can see all of your images. So if you want, raise your hand or type it in the chat, whatever is more comfortable. If it seems that I don't notice that someone's raised their hand, let me know and I'll try and get to you. Other than that, I'm not gonna stop to check for questions after each point, but if I see a question available, I'll definitely stop and make sure that we get to you. So let's begin then. What are international relations, or what is IR? I think like the easiest way to sum this up is just like how does the world connect with itself in a lot of different ways. If you want like a more official fancy definition, one that I like that's from the Encyclopedia Britannica is just the study of the relations of states with each other and with international organizations and certain subnational entities, right? It's basically just like how do these big ideas interact with one another. In some cases, these ideas manifest themselves as states. In some cases, they manifest themselves as collectives of states, in which case those are things like the UN. In some cases, it's charities or non-governmental organizations or things like that. One thing you'll notice, none of these things are technically real. What I mean by that is like, obviously, like what is Mexico, right? There is nothing that like in the ground says this is Mexico and that's it. And by definition, we know that to be true. The only reason we have an idea of what is Mexico is because everyone generally agrees, like that this is what the current Mexico looks like in terms of like geography, territory, people, etc. But that changes over history, right? If similarly, like we've seen as recently in terms of countries like Sudan, like 10 years ago, Sudan was one country. Now it's two countries. Does that mean does that mean that like those countries were never real, or how does that interact? The short of this is that all of these things are based upon the general like everything of IR is based on the general acceptance or viewpoint that these structures exist as such. we all kind of agree that Mexico is a country, whether explicitly or implicitly. But when we don't, that's when you start to have issues. And that becomes one of the most common topics. One of the most common things that we'll talk about in IR is what happens when these people don't agree on what makes up these different characteristics. But ultimately, it's the kind of a lot of IR is to almost like fake ideas or fake like mythology that unites people, how those things interact with each other, how they change each other's meaning, and how they give meaning to the rest of the world. The truth is, IR will touches on so much. It touches on sports. It touches on economics. It touches on geography, on environmentalism, on feminism and gender issues. Really, IR is basically just how everything else in the world exists on an international scale and level. So, related to that, why don't we talk? I want to go over with all of you over some motions. And I want you to tell me if you think it's an IR motion and why or why not. So, the first one. This House believes that a North American sports league, in seeking to expand beyond North America, should prioritize access and development to the Latin American market over the Chinese market. Is this an IR debate? Why or why not? Paula, I saw you have your hand up.
Oh, sure. If one of the other like debaters wants to like raise their hands, don't like be ashamed, I guess. Marianne raised her hand too, but I would say yes because I think you have to consider like all of the interests that a country has and sort of like their policies to see which you align yourself with, I would say.
Absolutely. Yeah. What's up?
I was going to ask you, maybe this is a little mean, but if you could ask specific people to participate, have more active participation from like newer kids. So just say like Fernando, and Fernando has to answer. But if he doesn't feel comfortable, then he can't, just to like get everybody talking. But yeah, that was my.
No, that's a great idea. Tell you what, if people start participating, then I'll just call on them as they participate. If I see that somebody's not participating or that no one's willing to try and answer, then I'm just going to call it random and so
Perfect.
be forced to participate. So before I call it random, does anyone want to? Oh, Santiago, you've got your hand up.
I mean, in a very basic manner. I mean, it deals with more than than one country, therefore is international. And making it to a relationship, it generates some sort of a it requires some sort of communication in between countries and political intent. Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think you and Paula are spot on in terms of this. I mean, this is also, I'll be honest, this is partly a trick question because you could argue that not every part of this motion is an IR motion, right? There are arguments that you could come up with on either side that are completely independent of actual IR issues. You could say, like, I mean, on the prop for one, you could even say something like, this will affect the commercializing this will ruin sports and that's bad and that's why we shouldn't do it. Not really an IR argument, but something that fits within the motion. But that being said, I think you are spot on in that there are significant elements about this that are related to an IR lens, right? The what sports are a huge way that countries interact with each other. This is why historically, right, like some countries when like the Olympics were in Germany in the or Russia or Soviet Russia at various points, like the US boycotted some of those, right? Partly because even if these topics do have to deal with more basic concepts, the engagement and the interests of what these different countries want, and how they interact based off of the circumstances that we're talking about probably means that it's an IR motion. So great job. So let's go to another one then. This House regrets the westernization of the elites in post-colonial countries. Is this an IR motion? Why or why not? I don't see any hands up, so I think I'm going to call on someone. All right, Santiago, we'll go with you again, but I love the enthusiasm. I will want to hear from someone else too. No. We can go with. Let's go with. I'm totally cool with you. Cool with going with you right now. I'm just saying after you, I want someone else as well.
Oh, okay. I think it not really a Nair question because although it does put us, I mean, first of all, it's historic, like it's from the past, so I wouldn't really deem it. I would consider that IR questions must be somewhat like the actions, no, to impose something must be somewhat recent, and it deals with it doesn't have a specific country or political affiliation that uh, supports the subject. I don't know if I'm getting my point across.
Yeah, no. Yeah, it's not. It's not like specific to any sort of groupings or people. It's more of a general topic. No, I think
Yeah.
what you're saying is clear. So I don't want to. I want to go. So Adriana, before I respond to Santiago. Adriana says yes, it is. Why? Why do you think it is?
I have an advantage, Julio. I am the global politics teacher.
Even better. I think especially important for them to hear why you think it is.
Post-colonialism is a very important theory in international relations, for instance. And there is like one big debate whenever it comes to basically how we see the world, particularly in international relations. We tend to have a view, a Western view, and consider the others kind of different. Consider them like, okay, so should they be different? Should we respect how they are, how they behave? Should we impose, for instance, human rights? Many things, because that is like the Western view, the liberal view, what we traditionally know as liberal view. And somehow this is basically posing the idea that basically these liberal values, okay, modern liberal values somehow are imposed in these post-colonial countries, making them somehow different from what they were originally.
Absolutely. So I would say that I personally am more inclined. I'm inclined to agree with Adriana in this case. That I do think this is an IR motion, but I also want to say I think Santiago's like analysis of the topic is spot on in the sense that it is true that this isn't specific to a time or place. This isn't specific to a group of people, but if anything, that's also partly what pushes it towards being an IR debate, in that you have to analyze exactly when we're talking about the westernization of the elites, what does that look like? How has that happened? Especially looking at the term post-colonial, I think Adriana was spot on in highlighting that, right? Because part of this is a conversation is what is the context in post-colonial states that has created these structures of westernization of the elites, and is that a good or a bad thing? What does that specifically look like? It's not necessarily specific in that we're not talking about one country, but if anything, you've got to do the work to think about how this might exist in specific situations, and what does that maybe mean? What lessons can we take away from those specific examples towards giving us a wider truth on this issue? There are things about this that don't necessarily have to do with international relations, but I think at the core of what necessarily causes this kind of westernization, what causes these post-colonial states, is at its heart an IR discussion. But this debate admittedly also does involve things like education, which admittedly can also be an IR topic. So it all kind of mixes together again anyways. But like education is a big part of this, right? Like the fact that a lot of the most common universities that we talk about in like how often do we talk about like Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge compared to like the UNAM and like maybe like to be fair in Mexico we do talk about universities like the UNAM and the TEC and stuff, but how often is it talked about in a relative manner to those other institutions, right? And so I think that's how you can kind of feed these things into each other. But anyways, that's enough. I love this motion, but enough about that one for now. One final one. This House believes that Brazil should fully privatize Petrobras. Just as in case, to be honest, I never knew what Petrobras was before I heard this motion for the first time. As a quick aside, it's Brazil's biggest petroleum company. beyond that, that's the main. Just think of it. You could replace this with like Mexico should privatize Pemex, and it's a very similar motion. Fernando, you've got your hand up.
I think this is also an IR debate prompt because it, although the prompt only says Brazil, it also influences all the countries it trades with. And with the petroleum being like a huge part of its industry, it can affect Brazil and other surrounding countries.
Absolutely, right? Does anyone know what is the name of the organization? Well, the O in the name of this O is the first letter. It stands for organizations that is mainly the petroleum exporting countries. Kind of already given away the name of it with how I've described it, but it's like Venezuela. I think Mexico's in it too. I don't know the list of countries, but it is one of the. It is the big organization of countries that helps decide and set petroleum prices.
Is it the OPEC?
It is OPEC. So exactly, that's the point, right? In this debate, OPEC isn't an actor that is explicitly listed in the motion, but you absolutely could talk about OPEC in this context, or talk about other similar countries that deal with petroleum, and how these things connect with each other in terms of the economic side of things, the environmental side of things. Now, to be clear, you don't have to. This debate could be one where the only conversation and focus is on internal issues in Brazil. That's why this motion is yes, but also possibly no, similar to where the sports things, right? If anything, this is why the main point of where I wanted to ask all these three things is that most motions that we think of like as IR motions can arguably not be as well. It's less that motions themselves are IR as much as issues that exist within those motions can be IR issues. So one of the things, for example, if you're ever stuck trying to come up with arguments or ideas as to why one thing might be true or not true, expand your viewpoint. Think about it on that international level, and that can be a really helpful way of figuring out other ways that these debates, even on smaller scales, can take place. But so let's go on to a little bit more IR specific stuff on the theory side. So these are very basic concepts, but I think they're helpful in terms of framing a little bit what are some of the most common discussions and common viewpoints about how IR works and how these countries interact with one another. These three ideas are realism, liberalism, and constructivism. Does anyone, before I go into explaining them, is anyone familiar with these and thinks they can explain? Why don't we start with realism first? Does anyone think they can explain what realism is? Is this something you've talked about in the class before? Because that would be cool. Nice. All right, well then it should be easy for someone to volunteer and explain what it is. All right, I agree with Marianne. Elena, let's hear what it is.
Marianne, this is bullying, first of all. Second of all, in like, it's hard for me to put the theories in words, but it's like a more conservative way of seeing like international relations. The state is like the main actor, and the state is like the most powerful entity inside the theory. It's much more of like every state fends for itself instead of like, it favors like national interests before cooperation and stuff like that. Gracias, Marianne. Yo también te quiero.
No, you were awesome. That's basically exactly what it is. You nailed that. I think there are generally like four, I think especially honestly, like framing it as like potentially the more conservative viewpoint is a spot on one, because I think it does generally line up with more conservative ideologies, in that there are four main tenets of realism. One being states are the most important things and the only things that matter, not even on like a so direct individual level, but just generally as these structures with like single unified visions. Secondly, there's no real central figure organization that really has power. So a realism perspective would probably think the UN doesn't really matter that much, or they don't really do that much, because ultimately what matters, or the thing that dictates how countries act, is related to the third point, being self-interest. The main things countries care about and will always prioritize is their own self-interest and survival at the cost of everything else. It's almost like they almost, like, realism almost sees the world as like a state of anarchy where everyone is just constantly trying to fight to survive, and survival of the fittest kind of ideology, which does relate a bit to like how the US is. And the reason why I have the flag here is because this relates a lot to the way the US has seen itself in the past, basically saying, you know what, the only thing that matters is that we decide what we want to do. We don't really care what you are going to do. We might take more power and things, but ultimately that's just because we think we're right. We think the US matters, and we're not really going to sign on to a lot of your agreements. This is why, like, the United States doesn't sign on to the International Court of Justice. No, the ICE. Well, actually, I guess both the ICC and the ICJ, partly because they're like, we don't want to be held accountable for a thing for our actions by you guys. I mean, they don't think they need to be held accountable, but that's the whole point, right? Like, it's more individualistic. So, with that in mind, before we get to liberalism, who thinks they can explain liberalism a little bit more? How about Fernanda? We haven't heard from Fernanda yet. No, okay.
I'm sorry, I don't take politics.
No, that's totally cool. All right, how about Vicente?
Usually, I think it depends on the context or the era that it's taken in, because it's a thought that evolved, but mostly individual rights, individualism, I think it's linked.
Yeah, no,
Civil
absolutely.
liberties, and I think it's also being open to new like ideologies as well, keeping open minds.
No, absolutely. So to be fair, the whole idea of liberalism is really confusing because it's used so inconsistently in different places. Like liberals versus conservatives, even in like the US versus Europe, is really different. Like liberalism and neoliberals and like different, like classical liberals are all quite distinct, or like they're all kind of related, but also like fairly distinct conclusions. So to be fair, whoops, okay, slightly out of order. So to be fair, this can be confusing, but you're totally spot on that the first thing is liberalism tends to focus on individuals beyond just like and this goes if realism looks more like states as a whole and like operating as a single entity, liberalism looks more at the specific individuals that make up the states, and acknowledging there is more of like a plurality, and as such kind of like back and forth that exists within these different people working together. As a result, the importance of mutual cooperation is really emphasized throughout all the different levels of liberalism. This is especially true at the international level, where liberalism is really the main thing that tries to place emphasis on the ideas of the United Nations being a manner in how countries can work together, that the WHO is a way that countries can work together. One of the main ways that it does this is liberalism does traditionally, especially focus on democracy. Capitalism a little bit less explicitly, just in the sense that it does advocate for things like trade, like international trade and like integration. And as such, like the only way those things can kind of exist and be absolutely true is in a context of capitalism, which is why like they're not explicitly interchangeable, but I would argue it's hard to separate capitalism from a lot of the main values that liberalism espouses. But mainly they push the idea that like if countries trade with each other, they won't go to war with each other. If countries are both democracies, they generally won't go to war with each other. Now, I'm going to be honest, I think that part is pretty not true. Like, the reason why I put the U.S. flag here as well is because I think this also sums up a big portion of American ideology, right? The United States is the biggest funder of the United Nations and similar programs. The United States does historically try to be probably the main spreader of capitalism and democracy, and has tried to create this kind of unification, even if it also has had a very realist perspective in different parts of its government historically. That being said, right, the United States, I mean, everything it's done with Latin America, right? Like the democracies might not explicitly go to war with each other, but maybe they'll send support armed militias in various Latin American countries, or fund companies to try and take over countries or economies, so that even if they're not at war, they do undermine and try and replace each other's structure to more closely align themselves. So arguably liberalism is like like in terms of the very explicit definitions of war, it is true that those types of countries aren't fighting that much, but whether it's true on all fronts and not just like the very explicit military front remains to be seen, and is potentially a matter of perspective. But that's partly the point of where a lot of like one of the things I'll tell you is, truthfully, I think it's hard to say like liberalism is always right or realism is always right, or even constructivism, which is also like a weird thing that kind of isn't like necessarily a third thing as much as like potentially part of both or part of a bunch of other things. Like, but the point is they all can be right in some things, wrong in certain things. And part of it is that it also kind of depends on the perspective that you're taking. These lenses are less important in the sense that like it'll guarantee that to tell us this is how a country will act in a certain situation, more as giving us, if we believe that X or Y things are true, this is the way that they will probably act. That's especially important to debate, where if you're making a case, you probably shouldn't say something like, according to a liberal worldview, the United States will act in such and such manner. Because honestly, a lot of those words won't mean that much. Like, same thing with like when you use economic jargon and it's like, well, the GDP means that the economy is good, right? Like the truth is most of these things are meaningless jargon that like might have value in their specific context, but in the context of a debate, just saying important words isn't enough. So I don't think you ever need to be in a debate, say like, we think the world acts in a more liberal manner or more realist manner. What is more important is being able to explain the way that you think countries act and why that is likely to create the outcomes that you're talking about. So you don't need to say you're talking about realism. You need to say countries only act in their self-interest. At the end of the day, survival is the most important thing. That's why countries generally, like, they might give things to other countries like aid, but they don't do so just out of the goodness of their heart. They do so because they think that'll help their survival chances in the future. So it does ultimately boil down to self-interest. I described realism, but I'm not just using that as like the framework for everything, right? So this is where these definitions and these ideas matter in this context. It's also probably the most boring part of IR, but I think it's the most important. And like, you have to understand the theory to then be able to like have these more in-depth discussions and talking about the ways that these theories either prove to be true or false. And then the last point, does anyone think they can, before we get to constructivism, does anyone think they can explain constructivism in a brief manner?
I've got a question, and is it related like to constructivist theory?
What do you mean by constructivity?
No, because like constructivist theory. I remember my brother telling me about it, but I don't know if it's related to constructivism. Though.
So what is it that you're familiar with? Explain what you do know, and then we'll see if it is.
I remember him telling me that it wasn't about the material things, but the essence of it. Maybe just like more more TOK things.
Okay, so I'm not. So to be honest, I never took TOK, so I'm less familiar with the exact things like that. But here, I'll go into it, and then we can talk about And let me know if this lines up with it. So honestly, basically, constructivism kind of takes a step back and almost says, like, rather than things being true, like if realism says because states exist in and of themselves, right? They are their own self entities, they're likely to act in an antagonist way, because they're always trying to fight for survival. Liberalism will say no. They might say they might try to fight for survival, but they'll do that in a way where they cooperate. Constructivism will take a step back and say, well, it kind of depends on the different things that create those situations, right? On one hand, agency does matter. Countries will, like, it is impossible to predict entirely the way countries will act, because the reality is countries are people. People are wild, or aren't always rational. They have different interests that aren't always visible. And as such, there is a level of agency that means we can't always predict what will happen. That being said, there is structure matters too. The contexts in which these things occur matter a lot as well. And so this kind of relates to the bottom point of the idea of, like, meaning is never inherent. So for example, nuclear weapons. England, the UK has 300 nuclear weapons. If meaning was inherent, the United States would arguably be much more concerned about that nuclear stockpile, because that's a lot more weapons that can be used against them, right? But because the context in which those exist isn't always true, it means that the realities of a likelihood of something happening aren't always equal. In reality, something like North Korea's 2 nuclear weapons are actually a much graver threat to the United States than the United Kingdom's weapons. So even though those weapons are the same weapons, the context in which they exist changes the manner in which we think about and relate to these items. So beyond that, constructivism applies that same kind of lens towards not just the way countries interact with each other, but even the countries themselves, right? Realism is much more single-minded in terms of that countries will act in unified ways, whereas constructivism will say countries are much harder to define because there are multiple visions of that, right? I think the United States right now is a great version of, like, there are different like the realities of different people in the United States are so wild that it's hard to say that it's almost one country, because these lived experiences are so dramatically different, whether you live in the city or whether you live in the country, whether you are a single Black woman or you are a wealthy white man on his 4th marriage, right? So these different multiple identities end up impacting the way that these different countries end up existing, and especially with a focus on societal and social norms, and how that impacts the way that we interact with one another, the way that we think, the way these countries interact with one another. So if anything, constructivism, like, it won't necessarily tell us the way that countries will interact, but it tells us that the things that cause them to act in certain manners are much wider, that are a much wider spectrum than what necessarily realism or liberalism tell us about these things. And so ultimately, when thinking about these things, with these 3 kind of theories, the point of them is to understand how they help us explain the way countries act, the way organizations act, and to kind of give us the tools to think about these things. So we ought to try and think about how if countries interact in an anarchical, always self-interested way, how does that result things? Can countries work together if they're always acting in their own self-interest? Similarly, if they're acting in their own self-interest, what causes them to do that, right? What are the self-interests that they are prioritizing? In some cases, does that mean being more aggressive and going more to war? In other cases, that means potentially being more neutral and passive. If those are the things that they prioritize their self-interest, why are those the things that they value? Not just on, like, a geopolitical level, but even like a religious level, a societal level, a normative level. What are the values of the people that cause them to think these things? These questions matter because these are the questions that help us come up with explanations in trying to figure out what might happen in an international relations debate. So on that note,
Julio, just before you move on, I think Isabella has a question.
oh, cool. Yeah. What's up?
Oh, thank you. I had a question on constructivism. You said that context in which it exists affects, and then I didn't catch what you said.
Okay, so I was saying like the context in which these like countries exist will impact the way that they act. So for example, like if realism says countries will always act in their own self-interest and will probably always like act against each other, constructivism might say that rather that it is more into that the structure of anarchy isn't actually as such, that it's actually determined by the way that these countries exist, sort of exactly what Adriana's saying of like there's no objective social or political reality. So rather than assuming that everyone exists in a state of anarchy, everyone exists in a state that they believe that themselves to be, in that in some cases it might be anarchy because the context in which they've grown or in which that countries existed leads them to have that frame of thinking, but that's not necessarily true for everyone across every country. And so it depends, the way that things will act or the way that people will believe things depends heavily on the specific context in which it all occurs.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. No problem. So then the reason why this matters, so where we can start applying this is in looking at the common different frames for IR debates and how things, and even just in general IR issues, what are the most common types of issues that we talk about? And I think there are four ones that stand out. Firstly, government versus government, right? This is pretty easy. This is just one state acting against another state. Wars are government v. government. Even things that aren't military in nature, even like economic issues, are government versus government. The immigration issues can be government versus government. They might include other things, right? And so the point is not every issue is like, if anything, almost every IR issue has shades of all of these different types of frames within them. It's just figuring out different focuses within these interactions, right? So secondly, there's the government versus the non-state actor, right? So this can be more, we'll go through examples of this, but this is a lot of like terrorism, terrorist organizations, right? Or environmental organizations, or educational organizations, or basically anything that isn't a country and is either company or nonprofit or association or organization that has aims, goals, desires, but is just not a state in and of itself, rather like a smaller collective of people, and how those things interact with one another. Because one of the issues here, for example, is power becomes an important topic within IR, right? Now, generally, one of the main things that's talked about is like asymmetric power. We can talk about that in the context of like asymmetric warfare, right? The United States kind of is the king of this, and that like basically anyone they go to war with is arguably asymmetric warfare, just because they have so much more power than everyone else, for better or for worse, mostly for worse. The same is true in government versus non-state actor issues, though, where there is oftentimes an asymmetric power balance, but it doesn't always go the way you think it does, right? If anything, oftentimes, depending on which state actor non-state actor we're talking about, they might have more power than the country. This is especially true if we're talking about like the big companies like Nestle or Unilever or Disney or these other like Facebook. These are non-state actors, but that arguably have as much, if not more, power than a lot of states because of what they do. This is not related to any of the motions that we're going to talk about, so I'm going to throw this example out here now. So personal opinion is, I think social media is possibly one of the worst things that has ever happened to humanity. And while there's a lot of really positive aspects, like it has created a lot of really scary things. Now, the main conversation that often has been in the news lately is the United States and how like fake news affected the elections and stuff, which is true, is an important thing to talk about. But think about how ineffective, for all the conversation about it, think about how ineffective that was towards actually dealing with the issue of fake news in the elections. And this was in the country in which Facebook was created, has the most presence, has the most ability to be held liable, and has the most amount of people working for it. Now, think about how this happens in countries like Myanmar or the Philippines. I would really, one IR issue to look, if you're ever interested in looking this kind of topics up, is just how Facebook has affected elections in a lot of the different Southeast Asian nations, where they have oftentimes one person reviewing the news for the whole country. And so obviously that doesn't make a dent in terms of the impact of fake news, and how that then starts to go back and forth in terms of like the, especially like this has been an issue in Cambodia, where the main political party that's in power then uses and leverages its relationship with Facebook to crack down on political dissidents. And as such, then as a result of Facebook doing that, it also is able to operate completely freely because they're doing benefits for it. So they hold the power of that country. And because if a country doesn't have Facebook, that's a huge thing, right? Like how, like it's the main, one of the main ways we communicate with now. So they leverage their power and their commonness to extract benefits from these countries. So the asymmetric power exists in both ways for government and non-state actors. The third kind of issue that we see are governments versus international organizations. So this is a lot more explicitly like the UN and similar types of like multi-state organizations. Other examples of this are generally things like NATO, ASEAN, or other kind of like international organizations that represent the interests of a lot of states, and as such are have some level of independence in the sense that like they are not run by the country's governments, but at the same time are still very much beholden to what the countries want because the countries participate and fund them. And so there is a balance between they are not directly controlled by the interests of these nations, but they also kind of are. So ASEAN is a great example of this, where generally the rule in ASEAN is that you have to have, does anyone, just to check, just to make sure I'm not jumping ahead of myself, does anyone, do you guys know what ASEAN is? Okay, cool. Great, I clarified then. So ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And so it's generally the countries that it principally involves are Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, Burma, but it also includes other states like China, and so China is one of the big, China is really the most important one insofar as, generally speaking, ASEAN has a principle of unanimous agreement. Almost everything that ASEAN does has to be done by unanimous decree. But oftentimes that means pro-China nations like Cambodia, like increasingly the Philippines, either tend to veto things that would create a check on China. So similar to what happens with the South China Sea and issues with Vietnam. And similarly, anti-China countries like Vietnam tend to not allow motions or topics that would benefit China that much. So, and this is a case where even if a country isn't involved, or even if the governments don't have immediate say, there is still these interests at play that affect the way that these works. And lastly is just international organizations in and of themselves. There are a lot of debates that just focus on what should the UN do? What should the WHO do? What should NATO do? And how does that matter in and of itself? So I want us to go through a few examples of these motions and talk about how we can look at this with these lenses that we've talked about and what are potential stakes in these debates. So firstly, government versus government, kind of. To be fair, this is kind of a mixed one also, depending on which actors you're focused on the most in Syria. But for now, we'll kind of frame this as a government versus government issue. The motion being, this House believes that the United States should disengage from Syria. Let's come up with an argument using any of the lenses that we've talked about. What is a potential argument in favor of this motion that touches on this government versus government issue or framing? come on. So I'll give you another 30 seconds to think of something, but then it doesn't have to be a developed argument or idea, but I just want the core root of what could be something that means this should be true. Okay, Santiago, I see your hand up. What's up?
I think in a super basic manner, from a liberal perspective, this should be done because both Syria and the United States will work on, for example, the United States wants petroleum, so in theory, Syria would support the United States with what it has, and that would benefit both of them, as Syria would also get what they want, money.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely, right. Especially if we're looking at things as if we're talking about what the Syrian government might want and how that might impact things. If the United States government's main priority are economic benefits, it is in the interest of the Syrian government to try and eliminate as much international intervention as possible, and to giving these in if it's beneficial for the United States to do that because they can receive this kind of compensation for disengaging, that absolutely is a possible argument for the proposition, right? And so here, the important thing of the reason why I'm asking you this is we're looking at the different actors involved, right? We're looking at the two different governments. We're looking at what are their main interests, and now we have to ask, why does that matter? In this case, maybe the United States prioritizes oil the most, and that should be the thing that matters the most. Maybe there are other things that matter here. So let's come up with one other potential argument for this one, using this kind of legwork of government versus government, interest versus interest, what can be gained on the problem. I don't think we've heard from Alejandro yet. Alejandro? Okay, cool. All right. Anyone else? All right. So I see Santiago has his hand up. So Santiago, what?
No, I forgot to lower my hand. I don't have anything prepared.
Cool. No worries. All right. So I'll give another one here, which is, what if the United States doesn't want to enter any more wars, right? The United States, even in terms of benefiting other countries or benefiting itself, generally speaking, the times it's engaged in these kinds of interventions in the past haven't really worked out, right? I mean, the United States is going on 20 plus years of being in Afghanistan. And on one hand, they probably should leave because honestly, they've done so much horrendous damage to the country. On the other hand, if they leave, there's a real chance the Taliban helps further undermine the government and destroy what's left of the Afghani army and make it even harder for the state to properly exist and succeed. So, but that's only exacerbated because they're angry about the United States being there. And that's just one example, right? And this is with even like less. There's at least some stability in parts of Afghanistan that aren't necessarily true of Syria, right? So if you could take a perspective of realism and say that for the United States' own self-interest and survival, it doesn't make sense to engage in a war that is entirely unrelated to their own individual pursuits or interests, right? You could use a liberal perspective and say the United States wants to help cooperate with other countries, and getting involved in this kinds of things will just further undermine the stability of the country. So even if they're going to work together, the United States intervening in this case isn't an effective way of creating that cooperation. You could even try and go like a constructivist way and argue that the United States should disengage because maybe what's going on in the United States right now is so significant that there cannot be a focus on resolving the problems of Syria until there is sufficient addressal of the internal problems of the United States, right? So you can come up with different arguments. If you think about these different theories, you can try and come up with different arguments on the same side, just trying to shift a little bit what are the priorities or incentives for these countries or actors and why they might matter. So let's try another one. This house as Iran would see, actually, no, I'm going to skip. I guess just this would be an example of a government versus non-state actors. The idea here being like, what is in it? Like, we have to ask ourselves a few things here. Like, and I guess this is the question I would ask all of you. Why does Iran generally support these? The government of Iran generally does give money to different terrorist groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, etc. Why does Iran do that? What are they pursue? What is their interest that they are pursuing by doing this action?
Well, sometimes like through like terrorists, they can create chaos. And then this chaos sometimes just benefits them like economically, or if they're an enemy, I don't know if this is relevant, but maybe a religious enemy, they want to create chaos towards that religion, even if that religion focuses around a nation. So that's kind of what they would be gaining from supporting military groups that are considered terrorists.
Absolutely. One of the most important things that is relevant to Iran and why Iran often goes and has very tense. I mean, obviously, Iran and Israel have very tense relationships for fairly obvious reasons. In that that Israel kind of represents the more Western imposed state in the area. But beyond that, beyond even like Israel and Iran, there's the issue of Iran and Saudi Arabia. There's the issue of Iran and various other of the Muslim countries, because even if they're all Muslim, they're not all the same sects, and that's partly where a lot of the main religious oriented violence that's funded by Iran is on Sunni on Shia violence, because Iran is one of the few. I always get confused which one it is. I'm pretty sure. I think Iran is one of the few Sunni states, whereas most states tend to be Shia Muslim. And because of how intrinsic this is to the state identity themselves, this represents existential threat towards them, which is why they go so far as to fund terroristic threats. So you could argue that this, like, ceasing this violence is in their best interest just for general survival. You could argue that it's in their best interest to be able to reduce tensions, in part because it's pretty clear that it's not like Iran is going to win any of these wars anyways. So if the issue is that they're not, so like at this point, what benefit is there versus other alternatives? You could find it, but you'd have to analyze again, what are the interests of Iran? Why are they doing this? Why might they change? How does this impact others, right? Because especially if Iran were to stop doing this, their relationships with the rest of the region might improve considerably. I mean, if anything, like arguably the United States is the one who escalated most recently a lot of the tensions between the US and Iran. And if Iran continues to cease doing things like that, at the very least, other regions like Europe might start to shift their support more towards Iran, even if the United States leaves them behind, because they'll see one side being more reasonable and the other side continuing to just fear monger. So there's, again, the point is a lot of different perspectives. You've got to figure out which are the right ones, which are the most important ones. Because we are starting to run out of time, I'm going to skip these other ones, but just want to list them just so you get an idea of like what are other examples of this debate. So for this one of NATO should unconditionally offer membership to the states of the former Soviet Union, excluding Russia. The idea here is, right, this is a non-state actor versus a state. This is a, no, not non-state, this is an international organization versus a government, because this is very clearly against Russia, right? This is orienting the main European conflict around what does Western Europe do in relation to Russia? How do they deal with countries like that are more pro-Russia, such as now I'm gonna have to look at a map of Europe because now I'm forgetting what's the country that has the last dictatorship in Europe that is right next to Russia?
Belarus.
Belarus, exactly. Thank you. Yes, Belarus. What do they do in terms of a country like Belarus, who might very well be more pro-Russia? What are they going to do in relationship to a country like Latvia or Estonia, which are more ostensibly anti-Russia, but are right on the border and have a fairly significant Russian population, meaning it's more complicated. So there's a lot of things at play here again that has to do with historical context, how this matters for each individual country, and how these interests combine together to deal with bigger issues within the region as a whole. So, and then finally, this is an example of the international motion of the international organization, another example of the international organization motion, but more independently, just in terms of, for example, the World Bank not financing natural resource extraction projects in corrupt states. That being said, honestly, almost every motion of these involves these like inter-actor fighting. Um, and this involves this inter-actor fighting. Um, but by Marianne, sorry, most of these have to do with the inter-actor fighting. But at the end of the day, the reason why we're talking about these things in different as separate ideas is because you can treat them as separate, you can treat them as together. It ultimately kind of depends on what you want to do. In this case, you could view this as just entirely independent of like what are the priorities for the World Bank, no matter how it impacts anyone else. You can argue it in terms of how does this impact others, because if suddenly the rest of the world is like, we don't like you, this is a bad idea, we're not going to fund you anymore, kind of makes it hard for the World Bank to be able to do anything, right? So you can look at it in either way. So finally, getting to the last two topics here. One, just what are some common pitfalls of IR debates and how do you potentially address them? Firstly, almost every IR debate is kind of like an MU, like think about MUN and kind of like emulate a lot of IR debates in that function, because basically you have to role play each of these actors and figure out what are they likely to do. Why might they do that? What is the most likely thing? Is that in favor of you or the other team? If it is in favor of the other team, how can you maybe turn it to the other thing? At the end of the day, almost every IR debate is entirely dealing in hypotheticals, because this is more basic human nature versus like whether or not it's like for example, should the United States intervene in Syria is a debate that doesn't really have a right or a wrong answer, because whether the United States should do that or not is dependent on how does Syria respond? What does the United States do after that? How do these other countries respond in comparison to something like a motion like, should we ban zoos? Where, I mean, admittedly, what do different zoos look like can influence that, but generally speaking, we know what zoos look like, and so it's easy, like most of the arguments are fairly clear in terms of like when this is true, which we know it is, this is why that's true and why you should prioritize it. In this case, nothing is clearly true, so you have to prove why it's true. Think about the hypothetical and ask yourself, what if it is true? What does that mean for me? And why, if it's true, why is it true? How can I prove that? The more more you prove things to be likely to be the case, the more you're likely to win an IR debate. Because at the end of the day, we don't know if any of these things are definitely true, but we can figure out what is the likelihood of acting in one manner or another. And this is where those different theories matter, because they are ways of explaining why something is likely to be true or not. Secondly, there will be times where you will not know as much as the other team in terms of an issue and in terms of a topic. And there's not going to be a way of fixing that in the round. Like, it is unfortunate, but the reality is it happens to absolutely everyone, because no one is a genius or an expert in absolutely everything. Try and simplify things. Try and just take things to their very basic logics and work them out from there. You don't need, if we're talking about like China and Chinese and Japanese tensions, right? Okay, let's say you know nothing about why China and Japan hate each other. You don't know anything about the history. You just know that they do. What are reasons countries generally tend to hate each other? Okay, usually it's resources, right? It's territories. Okay, well, China and Japan are very close to each other. Okay, well, that makes sense that maybe they fight over resources, right? So, okay, we've got one reason, right? How do you deal with that? Do you share resources? Do you come to sorts of agreements? You might not know all the important details, but you can generally intuitively figure it out by thinking logically of how countries or states act. This is probably the least constructivist thing because constructivists will say this all depends on context. And what I'm telling you here is basically try and think about these things as devoid of context as possible and just think reasonably how do people act in certain situations. But that's okay because that's constructivism is unhelpful if you don't know the things that cause people to act in certain ways. So in this case, oftentimes if you don't know something, try and defer back to the more simple explanations, and that'll help you come up with ideas. Maybe not the most in-depth things, but honestly, people might be unpredictable in a lot of ways, but at the same times, people will ultimately act in self-interest. People, especially states, will probably prioritize their own citizens. Think about ethnically as well. Like think about things also like the way countries like what do these countries generally try and prioritize, right? Especially if countries have and like try and make at least some assumptions, right? So in this case, like what are Japan and China like ethnically, right? Generally speaking, both those countries are much more uniform than other countries. Their conflict might not necessarily be an ethnic one. To be fair, to be very clear, China and Japan are not ethnically pure. So I'm not just saying that that is a fact, but I'm saying when you look at Japan and China's history, it is a lot less. That fight is a lot. The ethnicity comes from the historical context of them being China and Japan versus less of more of like a sub identification versus a lot of issues like in, for example, different countries of Africa, where because of British or European colonialism, just connecting random tribes together, random regions together, you do tend to have a lot more ethnic conflicts because people don't necessarily see themselves with a state lens. They see themselves more in a much more ethnic or tribal lens. And so this is where using these even if you don't know the full history of these countries, figuring out like what are the basics that you do know that might give you hints as to why they act the way they do will be really helpful. And then finally, institutions. If you're still not sure about what are possible arguments, think about all the different actors and involved in the round. So this can be like, okay, let's take it back to one of the other examples that we've talked about a lot, being Syria and the United States, right? What are all the different actors that matter here, right? So obviously the United States' government and the Syrian government are actors that matter. But what are other actors that matter here? Let's try, shout them out, type them in the chat, just name them. You don't have to explain them. Just who are people that you think are going to be relevant in this debate?
Maybe like informal groups like the G8 or the G20.
Absolutely, right. A lot of these, similarly, it's like, who are the countries that, like, when these things happen, there are refugee crises, right? Who are the countries that have to deal with these refugee crises as a result of these things? That can be another actor here, and those are like the G8 countries, the EU, other similar things like that. Great answer. What are other examples of possible actors?
Do like the people in the military in this case, the U.S. military or Syrian military count, like the people, the individuals?
So yeah, yes and no. I would say the military as like a structure in and of itself is probably going to be fairly similar to the government, at least in this. That's not always the case, but at least in these situations, I do think the military of each country is fairly aligned with the government's perspective. That being said, what you said about the people, I think is spot on in that, like, I think the people are separate from it, right? The Syrian people are the ones being oppressed by the Syrian government. What is in the interest of the people is very different than what might be in the interest for the government. The government wants power, the people want stability. So you can use those, even if there are one country, those are very different actors. And I think you're spot on there. Adriana says NGOs in the chat. Absolutely true as well. Think about Doctors Without Borders. Think about the Red Cross. Think about these different organizations that work internationally, the WHO, that trying to deal with these kinds of issues. How might these be impacted as a result of these? How might these be impacted as a result of these actions? Or similarly, how might these actors want to impact these actions based off what is in their self-interest, right? The deeper you go into looking at all these actors and what are the possibilities, the better you'll be able to come up with, even if the argument isn't the deepest one, you'll have a bunch of different ways that you can impact it. Think about, like, bring it up, analyze it. And honestly, I think you will make these arguments deeper the more that you think about them and start applying these different lenses where, okay, we've identified the people, the NGOs, and the governments and the military. What are all their interests? How do they interlie? How do they interact? Which interests do we care about most? How can we best promote those interests? Why is that our side? I think if you do ask yourselves those kinds of questions, you'll be able to come to these kinds of conclusions. And so related to that, I think understanding what are the most common pitfalls, the last part of this is, what are the most helpful things to ask yourselves in understanding different issues of IR and different issues of IR and different issues in debate. Now, a lot of this is kind of like repeating what I've said before, but I think that kind of the point is, and because partly this is the conclusion of the presentation, is that these are the main questions that I have been asking you, and then I have been guiding the presentation around. And you've been able to come up with helpful answers and helpful ideas about this as we talk about them. So ask yourselves these same questions when you're prepping. Ask yourselves these questions when you're writing your IB 20th century history essay on what happened with Mexico and World War II. Ask yourselves these questions and trying to figure out what happened or why maybe something else should have happened and trying to answer these things. So just in a quick summary, 1, figure out historical and political context. Again, even if I don't know what's going on with China and Japan, for example, do I know what's going on with the United States and China? I know that Japan and the US are allies. I know that China and the US are hesitant. Maybe that is enough to tell me that the United States and that China and Japan don't like each other, right? Similarly, like, I might not know what the deal is with certain parts of, like, Eastern Europe, but okay, I know that the USSR dissolved in the 90s, and a lot of the countries are still dealing with economic issues as a result of trying to, like, build up their infrastructure after that. Okay, so even though I might not know anything about Bulgarian history, I know enough about the USSR to make some assumptions about Bulgaria that hopefully are true, ideally are true. To be clear, I want to be very clear about something. Try and make realistic assumptions. A lot of this, there are times you're going to have to say stuff that you're not totally sure is true. Never explicitly lie. Always try and think about what you think is likely to be true. Research it afterwards. If it's true, awesome. Go into it more. If you realize what you said is inaccurate, learn from it, fix it so you don't say inaccuracies again. Debate, it's fun to win, but I think it's more fun and more important to actually have, like, meaningful dialogue and meaningful, like, learning from it. Because at the end of the day, trust me, I did a lot of debate in high school. I could not tell you almost any of the rounds that I had 10 years ago. I can still tell you of a lot of the things I learned about or talked about in the debates, because those are the things that last with you, not whether you won or lost a round. So I would, like, as much as it might not always feel like it's an immediate payoff, always value the learning and the truth over whatever competitive edge you might gain. But so use this historical and political context to figure out what is the most likely scenario for these things. Secondly, look at the actors. What are their interests? What do they want? How do they want these things? How can they get these things? If the more you figure that out and the more you look at all the different actors, you can try and figure out what are the different ways that a debate looks like. And then finally, what are the zero-sum / non-zero-sum actions? What I mean by this, the idea of zero-sum events is just, or zero-sum actions is the idea that there is a limited amount of things, right? Like, if there are $10 in a pot of money and I reach in and grab 5 of them, that is a zero-sum action because those $5 that I took, other people can't get now. So that is a thing that actively, that there are a limited amount of, or that there's a limited ability to do, and as such, that is a zero-sum thing. All of you listening to this presentation right now, not really a zero-sum action in the sense that other people could still listen to the presentation despite you being present here. And so that just listening is not zero sum. Now, how much time we use to answer a specific question, that might be more zero sum. So the point is just like how many things are exclusive versus non-exclusive. And so this matters because oftentimes you can figure out how can countries work together in a way that doesn't hurt anybody, where everyone is helping everyone. How or what if they can't? So, for example, in a debate about Syria, the United States intervening, like leaving or staying, those are generally zero-sum actions because the money that they have to spend, the people that have to be there, those things are ultimately zero-sum situations. That being said, in terms of economic support for the government, you could argue that that isn't necessarily a zero sum insofar as you could do that on both sides. You might have less money to do it on one side or less willpower, and that's definitely part of the debate. But you could argue that reasonably there's enough money where you could both just give money on either side, so it's not as exclusive in that regard. So figure out how this interact, and so this relates back to the interests, this relates back to the context, and all these things work up together to play these kind of hypothetical situations. Ultimately, the concluding idea of this is that if you've ever played role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, IR debates are arguably the MUN of Dungeons and Dragons and debate, insofar as just like you are trying to figure out what these interests are, act and follow through on those interests and prove why that is the case. Role play these countries, live throughout their ideas, come up with different theories that might explain that. And that can be a way of like role playing and acting, is figuring out what are the motivations that create these ideas and use those things to come up with further ideas in your arguments. I think if you do that, you will have a great handle on IR debates, even if you don't know that much about the specific issue. But hopefully the lens and the ideas here will help you not just learn about how to debate these things, but will impulse you to learn more about these specific topics, such as the crisis in the middle, like the immigration, the immigration issues in Latin America, the immigration issues or the migrant crises with Syria. You can talk about the Chinese, Japanese historical thing. Honestly, history is awesome. Like I guarantee you will find some cool part of history that appeals to the things that you find the most interesting if you look hard enough. If you like art, there's a bunch of art history, right? If you like sports, there's a bunch of sports political history. If you like economics, I mean, economics in a lot of ways is like the history of how countries interact with one another, right? If you like video games, like a lot of the way countries have interacted with video games has to do with like the spread of technology and international relations. So we can trace back a lot of these things to the questions and ideas that we've talked about today. I hope this is helpful and this has been helpful. Does anyone have any concluding questions, thoughts, comments, anything? I know I'm a little bit over time, so I don't want to leave you guys too long, but want to make sure that if there are any questions, we can try and address them and answer them now. Awesome. Well,